Carbur, a look back. Taylor County, Florida. The photo slideshow. Majority of content provided by Russell Ketter. Transcribed to PowerPoint by Hugh Roundtree.
Carbur, a look back. The town named Carbur has disappeared from the maps. Even the county maps no longer show its location. Yet other small communities that existed a few decades ago are left. Even Scanlon, another logging town which was set in operation over 10 years after Carbur was started, is shown on both maps. Not a stick or stone is left of the logging town that was located on the west coastline of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and thrived from 1914 until past 1930. It was once a station on that railroad, just as was Pineland and Athena, whose names still remain, but the railroad marker has even disappeared there. Burton Schwartz Cypress Company. All through the years of existence this mill was the pride of the county. It was the largest cypress mill in the world, and many came this way just to view it in production. Cypress timber, as shown above, was harvested along the coast and shipped to the Burton Schwartz mill through Carbur. Virgin pine. A typical stand of virgin pine in Taylor County around 1903. Gentleman on left is Mr. Sears, founder of Sears Roebuck, and on the right is John H. Lugridge, who founded Weaver Lugridge Lumber. As a rule, logging camps and sawmill towns which sprung up in many sections of the country lasted as long as the supply of timber was adequate. When that was exhausted, they picked up and moved on. But, in this area of the state, the supply was vast and the camps were more truly towns. In place of being transient, there was an air of permanency to it. Here at one time, over 1,000 men labored to bring in the huge virgin pine trees and the great red tidewater and the black and white cypress that had taken hundreds of years to grow. But the memory and tales of the size of some of those giants are still told, and the memories of life in what was reported to have been the largest logging operation in the world at that time are told and retold by the few left in the area who were in on the beginning, by those who went there later, others who grew up there or were born there. Information gleaned from many of these people are the source for this brief retelling of the story of Carbur. There is more, much more that could be included, and there may be some variance in memory, but accept it, please. Fond recollections. What was once the main line for the company's railroads that spread out in every direction into the vast forest to harvest nature's bounty, the trees, is now a wide sand road. Not too long ago, I traveled that road in the company of two men who knew the area well, although neither was there in the very first days. It was a trip down memory road for Alton W. Wentworth, who was once the principal of the school at Carbur and is a real historian of the county, and George Reddick, an 87-year-old man with a keen memory who went there right after it started as the master mechanic. It was a 45-year-old memory for Reddick as he walked into one field, overgrown with weeds and shrubs, to gaze at the old spot where the machinist shop had stood, just across the way from the roundhouse. Here some of the 14 locomotives once chugged in and out as they traveled over hundreds of miles of tram and spur lines to reach the trees and bring the cut logs back into the main station. For this was for the most part railroad logging, with occasional use of mules, horses and oxen. Heart of the operation, shops and railroad tracks with new housing for employees in the back to the far left. As we rode along, each man retailed such and such a building was located here and there, on the left and right side of the road that was the main street of the town. The ACL tracks, the main reason for building the town there, continues to be used by passing freight trains, but the giant logs no longer are carried on the flat cars as they were during those days long ago. Located near there is a section of the first paved road in the county, the one that took the place of the old sand road to Perry. Lawrence Borklund and others have said that it took nearly a day to make the trip on the dirt road in a horse and buggy. Paved road work was done by the convicts from the Salem camp. They hoed out the right-of-way and used shovels and scoops, drawn by mules, to construct the road. The two men, Alton Wentworth and George Reddick, both pointed out the spot where the post office once stood. Also the business office and theater. To the left, they said, was the location of the Carbur Mercantile Company that supplied the entire community and surrounding areas with general merchandise. They spoke of the barber shop, the dry cleaners, the depot, the doctor's office, a huge hotel with the nearby bullpen or rooms for the bachelors. On the other hand, another type shop not listed as being located at Carbur was the shoe repair shop. One is reminded that back in those days most people owned their own shoemaker tools and could repair their own shoes or else bring them into Perry. So it went until every building site that formed the town part of Carbur was located. Down the curving sand road where land stretched on either side now covered by weeds and scrub, there stood the ghostly sight of dead trees, bleached white. There, Mr. Wentworth said, camphor trees were planted by those who came from Louisiana, referring to the people who came along with Burton Schwartz for the logging of the giant cypress. These same dead trees mark the location of the homes of Captain Hugh File, who was the head of the entire camp, and a Burton Schwartz man originally, B.S. Dickman, the man who was considered a math wizard as he totaled up the daily payroll without a computer. He used his head, and Tom Johnson, who was at one time the manager of the mercantile store. Carbur HCL Freight Depot. Original Carbur office. These same trees are another legacy of the Burton Schwartz days, for they were planted around the Showplace Mill which went into operation in 1913 in Perry. Today, the mill's office and plant remain, the latter much changed from the old days. But the handsome office with columns that H.E. Lawland, the former employee of the company, says came from a fine hotel in New York, remains unchanged outwardly. Many of the planted camphor trees are still found in Perry. Farther down the road, Wentworth said, there were two other little settlements, subdivisions as it were. One was called White City and the other, Palmetto Heights, but down at the end of the old Dixie Highway was the town of Winchester, and its life was closely tied in with Carbur, in all activities. But why Carbur, and how did it receive its name? The story of that is intertwined with the great logging days that took place during the first 3 decades in this county and surrounding ones. It all really started when Governor Bloxham sold large tracts of land for the school account and thus bailed out the system. Many rich men formed companies, and one group was known as Carpenter O'Brien, whose president was S.J. Carpenter. Their general office was located up north. The company bought thousands of acres of land in Dixie, Taylor, and Lafayette counties. At Jacksonville they operated a large sawmill and had very ambitious plans to expand even further and own their own shipping vessels plus a pulp mill. Located elsewhere was another outfit, Burton Schwartz. They had some of their operation in Louisiana. The two were lured here by the forest and the deep swamps that were filled with fine cypress. The man who made the camp go, Captain Hugh File, in front of his home with his family. Town originates. They determined the area that became known as Carbur, Car for Carpenter and Bur for Burton, should be designated to be the heart of the logging operation, and it was known as the Carbur Logging Company. The town was laid out on a 640-acre tract of land. Burton Schwartz started their sawmill in Perry. This turned out to be not only the home of the largest cypress mill known at the time, but a show place. The office building, as mentioned earlier, was very grandiose, and they further embellished it by adding the formal garden complete with a fish pond. The roses were fabulous, and so was the other shrubbery and trees that were planted there. Today, though that place has changed hands many times, much of the early beauty remains. Ed Schwartz is credited with laying out the logging operation for the cypress and planning the dual operation. For here, from a central point, the pine needed for Carpenter O'Brien in Jacksonville and the cypress required by the Burton outfit would be brought in and then shipped to the different destinations. For some reason Carpenter O'Brien plans changed. It was then that an outfit originally from the North Midwest came on the scene and bought Carpenter O'Brien out in 1917, the H.E. Sawmill in general and the land holdings. This was the Brooks Hamlin Company. This new partner was one who would remain on the scene in the county for many years and leave an indelible imprint on the lives of all. For it was this firm which in 1929 decided to move its sawmill operation closer to the source and thus establish the town of Foley. At first, Brooks Scanlon was a separate operation, even to having different houses for the company's employees. In the heart of the stupendous operation was the machine shop and roundhouse. Mr. Reddick said when he came with them from his job at Burton Schwartz Sawmill, there were two sets of employees to service the rolling stock that was the backbone of the logging in those days. Main Street of Carbur, front left, rear of doctor's office adjoining post office. Left rear, greenhouse. Center rear, hotel, right front, Carbur Mercantile. Burton Schwartz Cypress Company Engine Number 2. Photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, Darcy 13005. Captain Hemsey had brought along from Louisiana many of his own people, including the Borklund family. The boys and girls were brought up at Carbur and from Buster and Lawrence Borklund, as well as their sisters, Thelma Beach and Thilda Adams. Much has been learned of those early days. Captain Bill Fisher and J.A. Faircloth were reported to have been in charge of the pine operation at one time. Early logging operations. More remarkable than any other aspect of the history is the method used in logging in those days. This was primarily, as I mentioned earlier, so-called railroad logging and manual labor plus horse. Modern sophisticated equipment that modern-day loggers use would never have worked then. Here, not only was the size of the timber so great, but also its location and the lack of any roads, other than a few sand trails, prevented any easy access to the huge timber stands. Huge trailers, bulldozers and timber harvesters just were unknown. The most complicated and difficult task was harvesting and transporting the cypress timber. The deep swamps had to be penetrated, and that meant crossing sloughs and ponds and every imaginable obstacle in what was then a virtual wilderness. Teams or crews known as contractors in many circumstances went ahead and broke ground. In this instance it was done often with oxen whose cloven hoofs could traverse the muck. There were many of these contractors. To recall are John Rollerson and Billy Bob Sullivan. Burton Schwartz Cypress Company Engine Number 8 hauling logs at Carbur. Photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, Darcy 13006. First, the area was laid out in sections and a definite plan of logging, as if done today, was established. But these men had to work in a very primitive manner. Buster Borklund recalled that Mark Hitchcock, the surveyor, prepared the maps and all the information concerning topography for the company. Hitchcock, he added, could tell the area's stream flow and knew where all the creeks were located. He knew not only the lay of the land, but he could also determine the board feet of lumber contained in a standing tree. In this vast acreage, the hardwood, pine and cypress were often found in close proximity, except along the coastal area where the red tidewater cypress grew predominantly. All the sawing and felling of the great trees was done by men wielding a 6 to 9 foot cross-cut saw, according to the size of the tree. The cypress logging perhaps was the most astounding, for it was done in the hardest, most primitive method. There was no other way. The men would go into the section to be logged and first girdle the trees. This was the knot cut around the base. It was cut when the sap was down and resulted in killing the tree. After a drying out period, the men would then go back and fell the trees. One man, Sylvester Williams, an experienced sawyer from Georgia, went to work at Carbur in 1927, and his recollection of the cypress logging is very clear. When retelling his experiences, he was asked how it was during the logging days. He said, "I never got wet. I just stood in water up to my chest and sawed and sawed." The longer the trees stood after this girdling operation, the better the timber was, and this dry condition enabled the log to float down the log pond. When the tree was felled, it was a struggle to bring it out of the woods. Everything that stood in the way was destroyed, for this was the day of go in, cut out and get out. Everything was cleared that stood in the path of the logging operations. The lines or cables were brought in and attached to the fallen, trimmed trees, which were skidded out to the loading cars. The wild animals, Williams said, never bothered them, and the snakes slithered away from the noise and the alligators went into their caves. Skidder loading logs at Carbur, Florida. Photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, M032415. Logging of the cypress perhaps was more difficult because of the terrain, but the mammoth-sized pine trees sometimes took superhuman effort to saw through. Buster Borklund recalls going out into the woods. Most of the people traveled by hand cars when they went into these different areas, and observed the black men handling with apparent ease the huge cross-cut saws that cut the towering trees. He said that the bulging muscles of their backs, bathed with sweat, would actually glisten in the sun. The hardwoods were cut along with the other species. This wood was used as fuel for the steam engines. This was during the time before gasoline engines were used. Some of the better hardwoods were used in the manufacture of furniture. The homes that were built then were made of either cypress or pine. Railroad construction. The railroads were also used to carry the logs into the logging camps for train shipment. Here the most ingenious engineering methods were put into use. The main line or trams were laid out into the areas to be logged. As the right-of-way was prepared, another crew came along and put down the dunnage if needed in low areas, then another crew laid the cross ties, while still another crew laid the rails. Then the rail cars came along dumping dirt along either side to build up the road even more. Now it was ready to carry the locomotive and log cars. The work crew would go out in one train and the work animals in another, the sawyers in another, and so on. The last train was always the logging train, which was loaded daily and brought into the station at night. Carbur employees' houses. Picture taken from top of water tanks. Main Street. All houses of the Burton Schwartz people had fences according to Buster Borklund. Present-day view of Main Street, Carbur. Notice the dead camphor trees center that once provided beauty and shade along the street that at one time was lined with houses. Captain Bill Fisher, pine logging superintendent. From these main lines ran what was called spurs, and each ran about a quarter mile from the tram. The skidders who operated from the main lines used cables and would pull the logs to the main line, where they were all centrally connected. Each of these operations required large crews of men and many horses, so it was no wonder that an estimated 1,000+ employees, in fact it is said as many as 1,200 men, were on the payroll. The skidders were the real workhorses, and they were pulled by horses. The horses pulled the line or cables from the main line to the fallen trees where they were attached to the trees. Then the line was drawn back by the steam skidder until the logs reached the cars where they were loaded. Later on they used a fork-sun tractor, Borklund told, and it was used with what was known as a groundhog skidder, which pulled in the same method as a convey log does. The companies made very sure that they got what they paid for in the way of timber logged by the contractors. Lawrence Borklund, who'd filled many jobs while there, explained how he would check logs against the contractors' tally who did the work with their own equipment. He was one of many company checkers. Other duties of these men were to inspect the land after the timber was cut. When the mill was running night and day, all the company's crews were out as well as the contractors to bring in more and more lumber. He recalls that as many as 120 rail cars at one time would make their way to Eastport to the giant sawmill waiting there for the raw materials. Included in his working life was a stint first as a fireman under Ben White, who was the engineer, and later he went into railroading himself. W. M. Fisher, General Superintendent. The logging operations required so many horses that a full-time veterinarian was employed to take care of the animals. A corral was built for them not too far from the present location of the zoo on South 19th, and a black community, called Goose Hollow, was built there so there would be people close by the livestock. Dr. J. L. Stevens was a vet, and he had hundreds of animals under his care. Of course there was a blacksmith or smithy to shoe the animals. The vast network of railroads was important and expensive. The steel gang, as they were called, would lay the rails, as Borklund said, 80 rails up and 80 rails down. This meant that was the distance of the operation. They were very fast workers, he added, and usually went at a gallop. After the logging had been done in the section, the rails were taken up and used in another area. To keep this work going, It was important to keep the rolling stock in first-class condition. This was the main duty of George Reddick and his crew. Reddick said that when he went to Carbur there were over 90 men in the machine shop and foundry operations. Then when the Brooks Kellen came in, the operations were combined. Logging expense went like this: 60% to Brooks Kellen and 40% for Burton Schwartz. Reddick, like many other of the men who worked at the huge logging camp, was a genius in his own right. They could make do with anything and adapt machinery and parts for special purposes. Here, Reddick said, the crew repaired and sometimes nearly totally constructed complete locomotives. Superintendent Fisher on his Go Devil. The ACL Freight Depot. ACL Freight Depot at Carbur, Florida operated from 1916 to 1930. At one time, Mr. Schwartz bought a huge skidder affectionately called the Titanic. It was made of especially heavy steel and required different size rails. In fact, it was so heavy that it could not be economically used. Borklund recalls that it was one of the few big blunders that were made in the operations. Reddick operated the shop with 20 men after he took over, and there were 14 locomotives, 55 or 60 tons each, to maintain plus the other rolling stock. He recalled the following men as being some of the engineers: Hinton Brown, Ben White, Gene Ratcliffe, Henry M.C. Ray, Bill Glisson, Sonny M.C. Creek, Earl Callahan, Casey Jones, Fred Wimberly, and Mr. Schinholzer. These men, Borklund said, were the glamour boys. Usually at least 60 full cars of pine logs would leave for Eastport every night, and, of course, there were the other trains that went into the Cypress Mill at Perry. According to Reddick, Bill Landry pulled the first log train into the Burton Schwartz Mill. The work trains would leave out around 6 a.m. every morning 6 days a week, and their return time depended on how far away they had gone for the logging that day. With cutting being done even as far away as Cook's Hammock, Tide Swamp, Salem, Steinhatchee and the like, the days were very, very long indeed. But remember, they were logging for 2 giant sawmills. Tales were told of the enormous size of the logs brought in. One that came into Burton Schwartz Mill was so large they had to dynamite it to split it, it was said. Other logs would require 3 or more cars each to be carried on. Frank Duncan, superintendent of skidders. What was the pay for all these different jobs? It varied according to the times and the job classifications, but by and large the loggers were paid good according to the standards of the day and the economy of the times. Living expenses were not great because of company housing and other benefits, but common labor would get around 25 cents an hour. Some made $30, $40, and up to $65, and the like a week. Remember, these were wages during 1914 until 1929, or 1930. The regular laborers were paid off every night, according to Buster Borklund. They would be given advances but could not overdraw. At first they received scrip or paper money, then later, brass coins. In some logging and sawmills, wooden coins were given. It must have been a tremendous task to keep up with all the earnings records. At least at that time, there were no deductions for Social Security and withholding tax. Many stories have been told of the trials and tribulations while out logging. Once there was a great train wreck and 1 man killed. Another time, a huge skidder fell off the tracks and on it goes. Of course there were injuries, but by and large perhaps fewer accidents happened then than in many industrial plants today where modern safety is the key word. They may have been some reckless, but they certainly got their work done. Arms were lost, legs received great cuts, and other accidents happened to the workers in the woods. But in those days they had the company doctor, or who was a prototype of the family doctor. His skill enabled him to take care of the whole range of injuries and sicknesses, plus dispense medicine and deliver babies. One of the 3 locomotives used at Carbur. Dr. J.R. Richardson, Dr. K.M. Davis, and Taylor County's own Dr. Walter Baker administered to the sick and injured during the years at one time or the other. The doctor's office was a dispensary as well as a place where he prepared his own medicine and made pills and such. Dr. Baker remembers well the first baby he ever delivered in Taylor County. It was a daughter born to the B.B. Widdens. He received in payment to deer skins and ham of pension plus the honor of the girl being named after him. She was named Jo Baker Widden and proudly bears the name today. Medical cost to the workers was at one time a low cost of only 45 cents. Most of the injuries and illnesses happened in the town. And speaking of town, what was it like for these men who got up at 4:30 and 5 o'clock each morning to leave out and not come back for 10 to 12 hours or more? What was their home life like and how did their families live? Life at Carbur, what it was like at the beginning and as time went along, is a full story. For those who came first, it was a sad disappointment, that is, for those who came from other regions of the country. For the Borklunds, for instance, Philda Borklund Adams remembers her mother saying that she had left the mud in Louisiana to find nothing but sand everywhere here in Florida. For Hugh E. Brescher, whose sister was the wife of Captain MC File, it was a virtual wilderness, more like a park with the various trees in such abundance. For newly erected universal climb skidders to be used at Carbur. If you look closely, you can see Carbur's horse Pullman in the background to the left of the closest skidder. In that time of life, what we take for granted today was not even in existence in many cases. True, the houses were sound and well built of either hard pine or cypress. Even the facilities were limited. Some of the more prominent, as it were, had electric lights early, but most made do with kerosene lamps. Philda Adams remembers her main chore as cleaning the chimneys and filling the lamps. There were no telephones in the houses. As for sanitary facilities, at first there was the simple kind, outdoor pits. Later the outdoor privies with the what Wentworth, who was there as school principal, called Biffy cans were used. But remember, this was the first part of this century, one that has seen so many advancements. Some have called the town wild and woolly, but was it any different from any other community even today? They had their good citizens who were upright, law-abiding and church-going just as today. Then they had the other element that went in for carousing, drinking and gambling, but that is true even now. So let us say it was a town of people, and people came in different sizes, shapes and with different morals. On the whole, this was an exceptional town, for the vice was controlled, according to Buster Borklund. It was acknowledged that the men who went into the woods logging every day would have to let off steam sometimes. The company attitude toward all this made a lot of difference. Seen in front of Supply House, left to right, L.R. Chesser, Joe Brescher, Bill Fisher, and Captain Hugh MC File. As in all camps there was one man of authority, and here he was Captain Henry Slaughter. His duties were beyond calculations, for it was up to him or someone he delegated to see that all the laborers were on the jobs every morning. Even, Borklund said, to going round knocking on doors. How anyone could sleep with the frequent blowing of the mill whistles, which they say started at 4:30 a.m., is unimaginable. On hand at the camp to mete out justice was a justice of the peace called Davy Brown. He also performed other work and was what they called a car knocker, one who helped with repairs on the freight cars that got damaged, according to Lawrence Borklund. Court would be held on Monday, at first in the railroad car where he kept his tools. Later, an empty office was the scene. For the repeaters, they were hauled off to Perry to jail. Buster Borklund recalls that some Saturday nights when the townspeople got into fights or squabbles, Slaughter, having no jail, would handcuff the offenders to a porch where they would remain locked up until morning. With 2 communities for the blacks, it meant that there were more of them than presently live in the Brooklyn section of Perry today, according to A.J. Ezel. There was a juke joint for entertainment, which usually had a gambling room including a skin game. Moonshine was readily available to both black and white, and the whites and blacks alike occasionally got into trouble from becoming drunk and disorderly. Carbur Mercantile Company. Here carloads of merchandise were unloaded regularly to supply the many wants of the people and the work. Original office, when first used, it was divided for the 2 operations, cypress logging and pine logging. Carbur Hotel. Remember, the proximity to the railroad, well, the drifters would come by for work. In addition to that, the company frequently had to recruit workers. For this, Buster Borklund paid a recruiter $10 per worker he acquired. These men would work a few months, then move on. Often, he said, the same men would reappear later looking for work. There were a few killings, from stabbing and the like, and sometimes the quarter boss, Henry Slaughter, would have to call the funeral director in Perry to come and get the body. If the body was found in the streets, it would be placed on a porch to keep it safe from the roaming animals. When one of the unknown died, there was a special burying ground which Borklund said was called Boot Hill. Its exact location is unknown now. But for all that, it was not better or worse than any other towns of the time. Only a few blacks got into trouble, most did not. Take Sylvester Williams, mentioned earlier. He said he could not see losing his money that he had stood in water all day to earn 2/8 liquor with his marked cards. There was a church for them used alternately by the Methodists and the Baptists. The blacks also attended school there. It is understood from many that for the Brooks Camden people, under the paternal eye of Mr. Foley, life had many special pleasures. In those days the white people lived in houses for which they paid nominal rents. Their water was furnished and later their electricity when it was available. There were 2 churches, Methodist and Holiness, for their worship. And in those times much of the social life revolved around the church life. Water tanks stored water to supply the many steam engines that were used in the logging operations. Carbur Mercantile Company at Carbur, Florida. There was the hotel and nearby the bullpen where the bachelors lived. In addition to that, the huge Carbur Mercantile Company provided not only food and clothing and other vital necessities, but had a drugstore of sorts, or sundry as it would be called today. Buster Borklund recalls seeing several carloads of merchandise being unloaded there simultaneously, and as soon as it came in, it was bought by the local residents. The logistics of food supply was very important. Remember, they had to feed several thousand people. When the logging went deep into the woods and far from the main camp, they would have to set up outer camps for a few weeks, and these people had to be supplied. Of course later, there were other outer camps set up, but these were more permanent and commissaries had to be established when the Carbur operation slowed down and finally ended. Movies were shown on Saturday night. In addition to obtaining groceries from the mercantile store, farmers nearby delivered their produce there on Saturdays. In fact, the housewives had it a lot better in those days than now. Each morning, both the mercantile clerk and the clerk from R.F. Chesser's store in Winchester would come by to take orders, and, believe it or not, these were delivered to the homes. How many housewives would enjoy that service today? Walter Allen, now living at the age of 89 in Perry, recalls his trips every week from his 40-acre farm in Lafayette County as he brought his produce in each week. From him townspeople could buy vegetables, pork, sausage, and other edibles that they relished. For these commodities he said they pay well. A reminder of the past, remains of the retort plant at Carbur. Carbur Hotel. The building was constructed at the beginning of Carbur and was used as a boarding house all during the existence of this logging city. Meals and lodging were afforded for those who worked for the company. Nearby, in Winchester also where Chesser's store was located, there was a garage to service the growing number of tin Lizzies and other makes of cars that traveled the road connecting Carbur with Perry and points in other directions. The garage was owned by John Rollerson according to his daughter, Verna Rollerson Hawley, and was operated by Joe Dixon. Later her brothers became mechanics. The people who lived in Winchester were considered to be residents of Carbur. They had the privilege of buying from the mercantile store, going to the theaters, and were close friends of the employees of the Carbur Logging Company. In fact, she said, it was a lovely little town and everyone was so good and considerate of each other. If one was sick, there was always a helping hand. In fact, all who lived in the nearby areas were considered residents of the town, also. Hugh Brescher recalls his first impression of Carbur by saying that it was miserable and the mosquitoes made life a torment. Drainage in the area and Dr. Baker's recommendation of having the houses screened took care of most of that trouble. Brescher was a bachelor and was related by marriage to Captain Ramsay File. He lived with his mother in the two-story guest house that all called the greenhouse. Green happened to be Mr. Foley's favorite color, and so the hotel was painted green. Mr. Foley made frequent trips to Carbur and always stayed here, Brescher said. And as did many others. He remarked that the Foleys were princes to work for. Hotel de Haas at Carbur. Brescher remembered clearly that all the natives wore guns and there were feuds at times between those who were called squatters. Buster Borklund said in the beginning these people who had lived on the land for years resented the coming of the logging firm, and resorted to burning the woods. However, this was not too harmful because of the age of the trees. For the most part, all who lived in that part of the county became close friends with the people who had come in. Many worked there and even came there to live. As it is the nature of people, one usually remembers the exceptional happenings or violent acts of behavior and forgets to recall the nice, easygoing parts of relationships. Brescher also recalled the friendship with Perry people and how he and others, including Dr. Richardson, would play golf at the famous Hampton Springs Hotel. Mrs. Reddick found that life in Carbur was very pleasant. The ladies met at the circles and missionary societies. Clubs such as the Ladies' Aid did much for the needy. Of course, there was livestock roaming the street as it did in Perry, and there was a constant problem with trying to keep the flower or vegetable garden. She remembers the cold spell that killed so many trees around 1928. Others speak of the time of the flood, when the creeks ran over and the water covered the town. Still others remember the great train wreck where a man was killed. C.L. Effinger, office manager. Some of the more socially minded ladies, such as Prissy, the wife of Harry Goodrich, land surveyor, formed a bridge club. The members joined with Perry people in that pursuit. Mrs. Helen Scales, who came to Perry in 1913, recalls the friendly relations that existed between the two places. Thelma Beach remembers there being a big mulberry tree in their yard, and lots of flowers. In fact, there is a picture existing now that shows one of the Borklund boys kneeling beside flowers that were planted along their fence. The group would get together, she said, and go by handcar into the woods as far as Dallas Creek to pick flowers and such. Although there were many horses, none of the girls rode but the boys did. She, like many others, attended the Carbur school. This started off as a one-room school with the first teacher Miss Williams, according to several. Later it became a two-story building and under Wentworth it was an accredited high school for a full term. Among those graduating were Thelma Beach, A.J. Ezel, and Willie Howell. Students from nearby communities came into Carbur for their schooling. Thelma remembers that a Mrs. Nelson came down from Perry to give piano lessons. One highlight of the day was when the mail train came in and everyone would gather around. Movies at the theater on Saturday nights were an outlet of recreation, and of course there was always fishing. The girls played basketball while the boys played baseball and football. Many motorcar trips to Keaton Beach were made. Mrs. Reddick said that there were no names to the streets nor were there any street lights. The electricity they did have was company powered and limited. But all the homes had running water, she added. Carbur Depot and residential housing. The main entertainment for the men was in fishing, hunting, playing baseball, horseback riding and having dances in the homes or else in the Woodmen of the World quarters above the hotel. The men would get together on Sunday and ride the horses for exercise. They called them the Carbur Cowboys, Borklund said. Horses have always played an important part in the life in Taylor County and imagined the wonderful trails they had for riding with the openings left from the logging and timber. Buster Borklund said that they traveled around to play baseball to places such as Howling Park, Adder Creek, Pisgah and Tiger Ridge. Transportation to the games was by car for there were many tin lizzies around. The Carbur baseball team had their own manager and played games year-round. Both he and his brother, Lawrence, were members, along with many other men. He remembers well the dances and also the now outdated bear hug that was popular in those early days. He remembers also the special festivals that the Brooks Scanlon people arranged for their workers. Sometimes they would load the families up on the train and take them out into the woods on a picnic. At Christmas, he said, there would be an open pit barbecue for all to enjoy. These and many other things were provided for them. Another memory of this was seeing the black workers entertaining themselves on Sundays. He would watch these men who had prodigious strength lift the railroad car axles high above their heads and hold them. Downtown Carbur with Shanty Town in the background. Mention must be made of the Carbur post office, which was listed in the government directory long after the camp closed down. In fact, it even retained the name of Carbur for a while after being moved to Salem. Several local people served as postmasters. Franklin Inman, postmaster, and a person well versed in the history of the county, says the post office was first at Salem. Then in 1915 it was moved to Carbur. A.S. Mangum was postmaster. Later his wife was appointed. It is said that Mrs. Ned Harbert and W. H. Denmark also served in that capacity. Many of those who lived in Carbur, as well as those who came from Lafayette County and below Salem to work in the woods or do other work, went to work in Scanlon, which was started up around 1927. Then there was Dixie Camp, Hampton, and Brooks Scanlon. But that is yet another story, very similar, just smaller in scale. When the Carbur logging operation stopped, the sawmill was operated there for a few years by Chester. Also, the retort plant was set up to reclaim the rich ingredients found in the pine stumps. This, according to Bevis Mangum, who lived close by, operated for about 5 or 6 years. The site and some of the buildings used in the operation still remain. The original site of Carbur, 640 acres, given over to W. F. Chester, a timber cruiser by Mr. Schwartz, was broken up into smaller acreage, according to A. J. Ezel, and disposed of in different ways. Some of the land now belongs to Buckeye Cellulose and to several private individuals. Carbur Shanty Town. Today, both timber companies and individuals practice tree farming, and the pines are still logged by loggers using sophisticated machinery especially designed for productivity. The flavor and hardiness of the old logging camp days are hidden in memories of those who worked there or were raised in one. During the past 60 years, the entire social-economic life has undergone tremendous changes. Now satellites move through space, men go to the moon and deep under the water of the ocean. But in its own way, nothing can ever approach the fullness of life as it was known in the small towns and settlements. People were close to people, there was caring and sharing and helping. So many names have been given to me. People say, this person or that person can tell you all about Carbur, but can any one person ever tell the full story? No, it must be like a mosaic, a bit from this person and some from another. Thanks go to everyone who spent time recalling the days gone by. Perhaps someday another will put down a fuller story. Certainly Charles Buster Borklund should do this, for his mind retains, with vivid recall, just how it was, how it felt, and through his recollections he brings it all back to life. One can see the miles of tracks, hear the cutting through of the saw, smell the fresh pine scent, see the lofty cypress as it falls to the ground or the giant pine as it topples. As one person said, in looking back, I realize it was a very good life. So memory retains the best of life, and all the bad times are forgotten. Three-way road on Main Spur. Carbur scenes. First Carbur scene, business office at Carbur. Second Carbur scene, home of Effinger and Fisher. Third Carbur scene, locomotive shop. Fourth Carbur scene, machine shop. Fifth Carbur scene, the way out to the woods. Brooks Scanlon Corporation, engine number 3, photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, Darcy 04268. Burton Schwartz Cypress Company engine number 8, 260, hauling logs, Carbur, Florida. The logs were being transported for the Carpenter O'Brien Lumber Company, 1916, photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, Darcy 13008. Brooks Scanlon Corporation, engine number 3, photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, PR 09135. Brooks Scanlon Corporation, engine number 5, photo from Florida State Archives at floridamemory.com, Darcy 13011. A litter wood skidder logging right beside Carbur about 1915, photo from William Wright. This slideshow was created at the insistence of my Facebook friend, Charlie Avery of Marianna, Florida. Charlie's mother's family, the Clifford Wesley Carlton and Laura Pauline Parker, came from right here in Taylor County, Florida. When I asked Charlie who all in his family lived and worked at Carbur, he answered me, "It was my mother's family." Her father, Clifford Wesley Carlton, took care of power and water supply for the town. His son, Charles Denham Carlton, as a young man, sold ice cream which was shipped in from Jacksonville, Florida on the train. Most of the content used in this slideshow was obtained from and used by permission of Russell Tedder. The article, A Look Back, was written and published by Louise Childers in March 1976, with many extra photos from other sources. A few photos from Florida State Archives at http://www.floridamemory.com.